Okay, so before we start implementing our wrist, let's go ahead and create our bones for the hand. So I'm going to jump over into Houdini. And the approach we're going to take for creating the bones in the hand is going to be very similar to the approach we used for creating the bones in the spider rig back in Technical Rigging 1. I'm going to create some nulls at the joint locations for the bones, and then I can go ahead and use a perspective view without a construction plane and point snap to those nulls, and that gives me complete control over both position and initial orientation of the bones, because if I bring my camera down to a bone chain, for example, let's pick on the first finger here, and we come down to look at it square on, that means I know I'll be looking down rotate X will be facing straight towards me, and that indeed for this finger is where I'd want rotate X to be. So if we point snap without a construction plane, that means we are going to be controlling based on the camera's axis as opposed to based on the world space axis. So it gives us a lot of control for creating our bones when our bones don't align perfectly with a certain world space orientation. So let's go ahead, and I'm going to start creating nulls and positioning nulls at various joint locations. So I'm going to create a null. And I'm not going to worry about naming these because these are simply temporary. These are simply to help me set up the fingers. Go ahead and grab the position of that null. Let's jump into a top view and move this over to our hand. And I'm going to be creating bones for the fingers that run from the end of the metacarpal down to the ends of the fingers, and the bones for the thumb will run from the metacarpal down to the end of the thumb. We'll then go ahead and create a palm bone that runs through from the end of the arm to the middle finger. So I'm going to go ahead, let's move this and start positioning these for our joints. Jump into a perspective view, get this positioned correctly in Y. And I'm doing this with the skeleton because it's a lot easier for me to get the locations of the joint pivot positions for the skeleton as opposed to on the geometry for the goblin, where it's a little bit harder to tell where the exact pivot points are going to be, especially since we know we want to set up both the skeleton and the goblin. It makes more sense to be able to set up perfectly for the skeleton and have that work for the goblin as well, because the goblin doesn't require quite as accurate placement, whereas obviously we have very specific joint locations here. So I'm simply going to duplicate this null and start positioning it at each of the joints. It's going to become a fairly repetitive process, so feel free to fast forward to the point where we have all of these positioned. It's the exact same thing. I'm simply going to position these in all of the joint locations, also creating nulls at the very tip end of the fingers as well. So that's going to be for all four fingers and also for the thumb. So Control C, Control V, and reposition that guy. So let's get all these positioned somewhere right around there in the center of the joint. Jump into a top view, Control C, Control V. Now I am copying and pasting with my mouse over the network view so that my nulls are all getting created in the same area. If I did it over the viewer, they get created down in the origin area of the network editor and not where I'm currently working, and that would be personally annoying for me because of the fact that I want to keep these grouped together so that later I can turn on their visibility and turn off their visibility based on which finger I'm trying to set up. So I'm Control C, Control V with my mouse over the network view, and that's keeping my nulls all nicely clustered together in the network editor. So position this guy for the tip of the finger. And again in Y position for the tip of the finger. Fantastic, so that is the first of the fingers created. We can Control C, Control V on that first null, jump into a top view, move that to the joint location there, jump into a perspective view. It's going to be a little trickier to see what's going on, but we should be able to get a good idea of roughly where in Y that needs to be for the finger. Slightly translated up just a tad. Top view again, Control C, Control V, and you'll notice I've separated these from the earlier nulls, so I know this is for one finger, this will be for the next finger. It just allows me later when I'm creating bones to turn off the visibility of everything except for the finger I'm currently working with, which is going to be very useful for us. So position that in Y. Control C, Control V, and repeat. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, this is a fairly repetitive process, but it's going to save us a lot of time, because otherwise we'd have to come in and reorient all our bones after creating them, and that could be a fairly tedious process. It's a lot easier to go in, get our nulls positioned first, and then not worry about reorienting bones after their creation. So let's position that at the tip end of the finger. That's 2 fingers down. I'm going to grab the very first of the nulls for the second finger. Control C, Control V. Let's move that over for our third finger. And continue. So position that in the joint location. Translate up slightly in Y. Back into a top view. Control C, Control V. Let's position that for that joint. Jump into a perspective view. Right around there, jump into a top view. Control C, Control V. Let's position that in the joint location. Jump into a perspective view. Get that positioned nicely there. Control C, Control V for the last time for the middle finger. Position at the tip end of the finger. And position in Y at the tip end of the finger. Fantastic. Jump into a top view. I'm going to grab the very first of those nulls, Control C, Control V. And let's set up our first finger, our index finger. So jump into a perspective view, and that's almost already spot on in Y, so I'm not going to worry about changing that in Y. Control C, Control V. Down to the next joint. And position that down like so. Jump into a top view. Control C, Control V. Position that for the joint. And in Y as well, something like so. And then finally, Control C, Control V for the end of the first finger, the index finger. And then after this, all we have to do is the thumb as well. Let's get that positioned in Y. Fantastic. Jump back into a top view. Control C, Control V. Let's go ahead and get this positioned for the start of the thumb. Take a look at making sure that's positioned in Y as well. It's pretty close. I'd probably drop it down just a small amount. Control C, Control V again. Let's go ahead and get that positioned for the next joint down in the thumb. Jump into a perspective view. Get that positioned in Y. I might actually tweak that back just a tad. Something like that will work out nicely. Control C, Control V, mouse over the network editor down for the next joint. Jump into a perspective view. Go ahead, translate this guy down in Y. Check that he is positioned correctly. Yeah, that looks great. And one more time, Control C, Control V, position this for the tip of the thumb. Jump into a perspective view, and let's translate that down for the end of the thumb. So now that we've got those in place, I can go ahead and hide out everything except for, I'm going to work from the back towards the front with the fingers and the thumb, just like with the nulls. So I'm going to hide out everything except for that very first set of nulls we created. So let's marquee grab those. I don't want that guy. Turn off their visibility. So I'm going to move the view, and I'm going to basically square up on the bones so that we're looking down from the top with this going horizontally, and that's so that I can see that this is a straight line. I get that horizontal in my camera, but obviously the rotate X for our bones needs to actually come down across like so. So we need to square up and rotate round, keeping that square onto the finger so we can see our nulls in our view. We can then go ahead and turn off the visibility on our skeleton, and that will allow us to see just the nulls. So I'm going to move the camera slightly just so that I can actually see these points here and make sure that I do indeed see those points and there are no points overlapping them. That's fantastic. I'm going to leave points on so that point snapping becomes easier. Jump over to the character tab, activate the bones tool, and I'm creating the bones for what I'm going to refer to as finger 4. So I'm going to give this a chain name of L underscore finger 4. We don't want any kinematics on that particular chain. I'm going to turn on point snapping, and I'm going to point snap from the center of each null down the finger from the very start to the tip end. So I'm going to start here and point snap from that null to the center of this null, to the center of the next null, and then to the center of the final null. If I push enter to accept that, turn off point snapping temporarily, you'll see that we created the bones and they now have their rotate X such that it was facing our camera. That's going to work out fantastically for us, because if we bring the geometry back on our skeleton temporarily, you can see that now their rotate X is exactly how we need it for the fingers in our hand. This is the axis that they should be rotating on if possible, and that indeed is the axis that the bones are rotating on. Fantastic, so we can now grab these bones. Let's grab those. I'm going to maximize our network editor for a second. Let's move them up towards where we're working with our arm. And for now I'm just going to leave them here. Once we've done dealing with our nulls, we can delete out all our nulls, and then we can position these and get these set up to look a little bit more like a hand rather than just a series of nodes. Right now that's going to be fine for what we need. So I'm going to delete out that first set of nulls, the set of nulls we just used to create that bone chain. And then I'm going to turn on the visibility of the next set of nulls so that we can set up the next finger. So I'm going to align so that this is close to horizontal in our view. And then I'm going to tumble the view around, trying to keep that square on. Do want to turn off the visibility of our geometry. To do that, I'm actually just going to turn off geometry using the display settings in the view. So I'm clicking on the small glasses and I'm turning off the visibility of geometry there. So let's turn off the visibility of geometry. I'm also going to turn off the visibility of bones so that I can only see the nulls, and that's going to give me a lot easier of a time of setting this up. So let's activate the bones tool. Now I'm dealing with finger 3, not finger 4. So we can go ahead, and I'm going to point snap again from the center of each null down to the next null. I do have point snapping turned off, so let me push the delete key to undo that first point that I created. Turn on point snapping with the V key and point snap down, making sure that I get the center point of each null. If I can't quite see it, I will tumble the view very slightly. It won't make a huge difference to the orientation of the bones, but it will allow me to snap successfully. We can even zoom in, making sure that we keep square on, making sure that I snap to the center points of each of those nulls. Enter to accept. Obviously our bones look like they disappeared. That's fine. We have bones turned off. If we turn bones back on, we can see that our bones indeed have been set up for that finger. So I'm going to deactivate the bones tool. I'm then going to home up our view in the network editor, and we've already got those nodes selected, so I'm going to grab those nodes and move them up with our nodes for finger 4. We can also delete out those nulls that we just created for that finger, and then turn on the visibility of the nulls for the next finger along. I'm also going to turn back on geometry for a second. Let's get our perspective view set so that we are square on to that finger, tumble around something like so, turn off geometry, turn off the visibility of bones, and make sure that we can indeed see the center point. That's going to be a small problem. It shouldn't be too bad if I just zoom in. Make sure we can see the center point of each of these guys. So something like that will work out fantastically. Activate the bones tool. Let's make sure this is now for finger 2. And I'm going to, with point snapping still enabled, point snap from the center of each null and work my way down the finger. Enter to accept that. Again, our bones look like they disappeared. If we turn back on the visibility of bones, we can see that our bones were created successfully. Fantastic. So with that in place, again, let's home up the view. I'm going to move those nodes that are already selected for us automatically up with the other nodes for our hand. And then I can delete out those nulls that we just created. So let's delete out the nulls for that finger. Turn on the visibility of the nulls for the next finger along. This is going to be for our first finger. and temporarily turn back on the visibility of geometry. So again, repeating that process, square up on the finger, tumble our view around so we're still square onto the finger, turn off the visibility of geometry, turn off the visibility of bones, activate the bones tool. We're dealing with finger 1, still have point snapping enabled, and I want to point snap to the center of each of these nulls, so that indeed is the center of that null. And it didn't want me to point snap to that null, so let me see if there's any way that I can turn off the visibility of, I guess they're nulls. Yeah, it's going to turn off the visibility of both the nulls that we are trying to snap to and of course the roots of the bones together. So I'm going to manually turn off the visibility of those guys so that I can snap to that point without selecting the bones. So let's activate our bones tool again and snap to that point. I will have to zoom in order to do that. Houdini is adamant on selecting that guy. That's fine, we can actually activate the bones tool in any orientation of our view because of the fact that we are only going to define the orientation of our bone after we create the second point of it. That means I can now turn back on our geometry. And with that geometry on and point snapping on, Houdini is actually going to be a little bit slow, so I'm going to turn off point snapping just for a second so that Houdini decides to speed back up. Just give Houdini a second, as with the recording going on this machine and everything else, it's not the fastest machine in the world that I'm recording on. So it's a little bit slow and we have point snapping and a whole load of points to deal with. So I'll turn off the visibility of geometry, turn back on point snapping. There we go. So let's go ahead and create those bones. Turn on the visibility of bones. We can see our bones were created there, and you can see that the orientation of that bone was defined only when we created the second point of that bone and not the first point of that bone. So now that that's in place, I'm going to go ahead, make sure we deactivate our bone tool. Again, our bones are going to be selected for us, so let's go ahead and move those up with our other bones. Whilst I'm here, we know that we don't need the visibility or selectability of the roots, so I am just going to turn that off on all of our root objects. So let's delete out the nulls that we created for our first finger, turn on the visibility of the nulls for the thumb, and let's set up our thumb. So I'm going to bring back our skeleton geometry, and that's with the view. There we go, fantastic. And the thumb, we know that the rotate X on the thumb is probably going to actually be easier if we bring up the goblin just for a second, so we can see the goblin geometry. If you see where the goblin geometry has the thumb oriented, we can see there's the other knuckle for the thumb, and we know that the thumb, if you look at your own thumb, rotate X really is oriented around about like so. We know that the thumb, the lower thumb, will rotate about that point. So I'm going to set up my view something like so. That's going to give us rotate X for those thumb joints. We can now turn off the visibility of geometry. I'm going to turn off the visibility of bones. Activate the bones tool. I'm going to change the chain name to L_thumb. And let's point snap from that null down to the center of the next null, to the center of the next null, and finally to the, and that was not the center, to the center of the next null. Enter to accept that. Let's turn back on the visibility of our bones. We can see there are our thumb bones. If we turn back on the visibility of our geometry, we can see that those thumb bones are nicely aligned with the orientation of our thumbs. That's going to work out fantastically for us. So let's go ahead, grab those newly created thumb nodes. I am going to turn off the visibility of both pieces of geometry since we're not going to be working with the geometry for the next little while. And bring these back up. Let's select them again. Bring these back up to where our other nodes are. I'm then going to go ahead, delete out those nulls. And we can now start working with getting these set up in the network editor so they look a little bit more like a hand. So I'm going to turn off points. Let's make sure that we're dealing not with the bones tool. I'm going to boost our network editor, maximize our network editor, and I'm going to lay this out as a hand on the left hand side of the character as if the palm was facing towards us with the thumb up at the top of the network editor. So we'll have thumb, first finger, second finger, third finger, and so on down the hand. Whilst I'm there, let's turn off the visibility, selectability of the root. Let's grab all of our bones, turn off their selectability, and give them a orangey yellow node color. And then let's rearrange these in the network editor. So I'm going to grab our thumb root. Let's move him up here like so. I'm leaving a little bit of room for when we set up our wrist control. And I'm going to have the thumb sticking out towards the top, so something like this. I'm going to give myself quite a bit of space. We're going to be coming in and creating a number of controls when we set up the various parts of the hand, so I want to leave myself a nice bit of space so that these don't all get clustered together. So let's give ourselves our finger. Our finger obviously is going to be substantially longer than the thumb. Then we can go ahead and set up the second finger, which will be slightly longer than that first finger. And the third, which will be very similar, if not slightly shorter than the first. And then finally the fourth, which is going to be quite a bit shorter than the third. Fantastic. Now I do have one last bone that I'd like to create for the hand. I want to create a palm bone that runs from the end of the upper arm down to the start of the middle or second finger. Now, the fingers and thumb are going to be parented underneath the palm bone. The palm bone itself is not going to be attached to the arm in terms of parenting. That's actually going to be controlled directly by the result of our wrist controls, whether that be attached or detached, and we'll deal with that over the next couple of videos. Right now, I just want to get the bone created and in place. Now to do that, I want to turn off the visibility of some of these guys because I want to point snap to the end of our wrist and to the start of our second finger. That means I need to turn off the visibility of our first, third and fourth fingers. I'll also go ahead and turn off the visibility of our thumb as well. And jump into a front view to control our orientation with space 3. Turn off the visibility of everything except for our bones, which in this case we just need to turn off nulls. And then I'll activate the bones tool. Let's create an L underscore palm for the chain name. And I'm going to go ahead and point snap to the end of our lower arm and then point snap to the start of our second finger. That will create our palm bone. If I move down in our network editor, I'm going to rename the palm root to palm root like so. Let's delete the one off the end, and I'm going to delete the underscore bone 1 from the palm bone itself. Give that a yellowy orange no color. Turn off selectability and visibility of the root. Grab both of those nodes. Let's move them up with our hand. So right around here. Let's maximize our network editor again just for a second. So I'm going to have the palm root. Coming from the palm root is going to be the palm, and the palm is going to go to all of our fingers. So I'm going to grab all of the roots for the fingers and the thumb. Let's bring up our parameters, make sure that we do indeed have keep position when parenting set, and parent those into our palm. We'll see that that won't affect anything in the view. Of course, we do need to bring back the visibility of the rest of our bones. Let's do that now. Grab all of those guys, bring back their visibility. I'm going to home up, jump into a perspective view. Fantastic. So now if we were to grab our palm, we can see the palm is not attached to the arm, so if the arm was to move, that isn't going to affect anything. But if we grab the palm itself and start rotating the palm, that is going to rotate the hand as a whole. So later on when we control this with our wrist control, that is going to allow us to orient the entire hand. Do you want to go ahead, let's bring back our nulls so we can see our nulls in the view. And with that, that is going to wrap up the creation of the hand bones. Thanks a lot, everyone.